Useless Monster by Mute Crows. Chapter 15, or Chapter 14. Izuku bounced his leg rapidly under the desk, head nestled in his arms as he tried to relax. Yagi had missed their morning meetup to exchange bento and also just generally talk. The talk part was new for the morning still, but Izuku enjoyed listening to his mentor talk about how hero life works and such. Well, hero life for him is number one at least. He was getting better about actually opening up about information, according to Yagi, who had beamed when Izuku had started to immediately answer questions without worry, where he once would have at least hesitated. The missed meeting had him feeling much more wired than normal, even though he could now feel Yagi somewhere on campus. It was halfway through lunch, and he had been hoping to unwind a smidge in the classroom with a sorry excuse of a nap, but his body refused. Honestly, any form of unwinding would be greatly appreciated at this point. Hero Fundamentals was next on the daily schedule. A class that would without question require some form of cooperation between him and one or more other classmates. He wasn't worried about the cooperation per se, more the socializing that cooperation entailed. Something he could feel was going to drain him entirely. He was already tired from working through an absurd amount of the night. There was a bit of trouble finding work around his school hours that also gave him reasonable hours to do homework. It didn't help that the two different areas he tried sleeping in had been disrupted by cops politely asking him to change locations to a less actively used area, as if any part of a large city was not actively being used at odd hours of the day. Not if he didn't want to risk getting mugged in his sleep. Disrupted sleep, bad work schedule, attempted studiousness, and bitter hunger had him feeling just peachy. So, when the end bell for lunch rang and the class came trickling back in, he stayed leaned onto his desk. If Aizawa was going to find issue with it, he could say it when he entered the room. Although the moment said teacher did walk in, Izuku found himself straightening up on impulse, still unable to shake the feeling he was being studied by him.
All right. Today is a sort of deviation from the standard class you have experienced thus far. It was decided the class shall be hosted by a 3-person team, including me, who we will be meeting with on site. Today's course will focus on...
He flipped the card in his hand so that the class could see it.
Rescue scenarios. Heroes are often called to help in disasters, both local and national. This will be your first step into that field.
Everyone sat quietly at attention as Aizawa spoke. He scanned over them, and Izuku, feeling a little bolder than usual, locked eyes with him and narrowed his gaze in scrutiny. There was an acidic little speck in him about the concept of heroic rescues. Too many childhood nights in the cold to really embrace the concept in the glowing herald the public at large did. He stomped it down, though, as Aizawa continued to speak, explaining things about costumes and considerations to have about them. He couldn't hold heroes to such unrealistic standards. There was no physical way to save everyone, and he wasn't the only example of that. Sometimes you have to save yourself, and he was viscerally aware of the fact. There were too many people in the world to save all the ones that needed it. It was an absurd expectation and a hypocritical stance to hold when he himself knew he couldn't save everyone with his quirk. Baton Pass was just healing, just as much as super strength is just strength, and so on. Application of skill is the only difference between the heroes, the villains, and the civilians between.
Be in the bus lot in 15 minutes. We have to account for travel time in today's schedule, so the faster you get there, the faster we can leave. That's it.
Aizawa was out of the door before anyone could even come up with a question. Well, he seems pricklier than usual already today, Mina said as she hopped over her desk to leave. Must not have slept well. Zero stretched his arms above his head.
With how much he sleeps in class, I don't think he ever sleeps well, dude,
Kaminari said as he followed them out. Much of the class stayed in a general cluster as they set out for the locker rooms. Izuku dipped past the crowd just inside the doors to the locker room and threw on his outfit as fast as he could. He left behind the mouth and neck guard. He didn't want to wear it when he still needed to send in the adjustment request to fix the issue Recovery Girl brought to his attention. The rest of the boys seemed to be finishing with gear, so he waited back some. When the room was mostly empty, he slipped back out and looked for Shinso. As soon as he spotted him, he fell into step just behind him. Neither said anything even as they got to the bus slot and the class bustled around them, noisy conversations jumbling together already, even with only 18 other students actually interacting. The bus and Aizawa somehow both arrived in sync, which riled the class even more overall. Shinso looked down at him as they waited outside the bus quietly, the rest of the class near vibrating in excitement at this point.
Why are you hanging so close to me today? Usually you're with Speedster and Sunshine over there. Not that it's an issue. I'm just curious.
He vaguely waved a hand in the direction of Ida and Uraraka, who were both loudly exclaiming bus instructions and general vibrancy, respectively.
You're calmer. Ah, so you need a recharge. I got you.
He nodded as he stepped slightly closer to Izuku, as if he could give him energy via sheer proximity. Izuku glanced up at him with a slight smile. The hero course was a strange place to be after years of bad classmates. Strange in a comforting way that he was still adjusting to. He figured it should have gone without saying that the hero course was generally made up of people who genuinely wanted to do good by others in the world. The whole being nice to Izuku trend still had him reeling internally, but he found himself finally starting to enjoy it. There was barely any internal questioning about it as he followed Shinso onto the bus with the class, both blatantly ignoring Ida's instructions of lining up by seating order, although that request was unanimously ignored the moment they all saw the bus layout. He ended up between Shinso and Tsuyu on the bus seat, the former having reclined into the cushion and slung an arm behind his shoulders. So, that full-thunder energy about bus seating was kind of pointless, Ida? Mina said, patting Ida's shoulder sympathetically. Cut him some slack! The energy is on point no matter how he uses it! Kirishima mimed the way Ida waved his hands through the air with a grin.
Ida really has, present mic levels of energy, but in a more, it feels more crisp.
Kaminari, what is that supposed to even mean? Jiro spoke up from one of the bench seats near the back, unplugging from her phone as she tuned into the conversation. No, I think he's onto something here. Mina had a thoughtful look as she sat back in her seat. If Ida makes it through school with that energy intact, that would be a big benefit for him on the whole marketing front for the pro world, Kirishima pointed out. Yeah, but energy isn't the only factor to popularity level at large. There's also looks and accessibility to different demographics, especially if you are looking to literally market yourself through toys and other merchandise, Carol.
On that front, Ida has the bonus of family history. Wait, if we go back to solely based on energy for marketing, then Bakugo is an absolute bust.
Kaminari interrupted Shinso.
Ha!
Bakugo sat up sharply. You got a problem with me, Static?
No, I'm just saying you act like you were born and raised feral, dude.
Bakugo stood up and gripped the bar in front of him, almost literally bristling at the comment.
What is that supposed to mean? I'll end your career right now!
Izuku tried to shrink into Shinso's space as subtly as he could, anything to get away from Bakugo as much as possible, even if the rage wasn't pointed at him this time.
Bakugo, sit down. We're almost there,
Aizawa said from the far front seat of the bus. The class went quiet immediately, aside from a few suppressed laughs as everyone started to look out the windows hoping to catch sight of their destination. The dome of the building was blinding from the sun glaring off its curve.
Looks like a planetarium,
Shinso whispered to him. Izuku looked at him in confusion. What's a planetarium?
What? You've never been to a planetarium?
Izuku shook his head.
You go inside a giant dome and they show you super detailed time lapses of the night sky. It's really cool. We'll have to go sometime.
The bus pulled to a stop and Aizawa quickly stepped off, the rest of the class on his heels. Izuku found himself clustered in the middle of his now usual quartet, as well as Koda, who was waving his hands around in the general direction of Shinso. Shinso raised an eyebrow before apparently answering the movements by dragging his index finger in a short arc from his ear towards his mouth. Koda shook his head, but looked excited nonetheless. Interesting. Izuku stopped watching their seeming conversation, feeling like he was idly eavesdropping even though he couldn't understand any of it. Once inside, the exclamations of shock and awe spread across the entrance floor. A hero crested the stairs before them and stretched their arms wide as if presenting the building to them.
Landslides, floods, fires, mountain disasters, and more. There are many areas that may be pushing you in and out of your areas of expertise that you will need to gain experience in. This is a training field that I made to simulate all of these scenarios for up-and-coming heroes like yourselves. I call it the ultimate space for gems.
Even with the helmet, Izuku could feel their excitement and pride in their creation. 13! That's the space hero number 13! They do spectacular work in the field of disaster relief! Uraraka bounced excitedly next to him. He laughed quietly as he watched her practically float off the ground with how much she was jumping in place. Big fan, I take it? She turned to him with a serious look. Deku! 13 has been and will always be my star idol! Was that a pun? Izuku couldn't help but smile at the dumb joke. That was the truth. The class started to talk amongst themselves, debating what areas they may be going to first or what tasks they may be given. Aizawa walked up to 13, looking past them and around the immediate area.
Oh, am I not here yet?
He sounded blatantly annoyed at having to ask the question.
From what I was told, he is on a restricted schedule at the moment.
They held up 3 fingers.
So no, he isn't.
Where is he then?
Izuku almost responded that he was back at main campus, but cut the reply off before it even began. He didn't exactly have a way to explain how he knew that, without revealing some key information about Yagi's health that was purposefully hidden from the public. He didn't know how much the staff knew, but the class sure didn't have a clue.
The lounge.
Aizawa huffed quietly before shrugging.
No matter. We don't need him here for the lesson to continue.
13 nodded before stepping forward, getting the attention of the class by clearing their throat.
All right. Before we begin, I have a few things I want to cover.
They began to go over information about their quirk, its benefits and detriments, and how those have to be worked around in rescue situations. Izuku was listening, but noticed something was off. Not with 13 or the class, but he could feel it. Literally. There was an extremely muffled ache nearby. It was close enough that he knew he should be able to see it in the plaza below. It had him feeling jittery. Something was happening and he couldn't see it. He started to raise his hand, wanting to get someone's attention at least, even if he didn't get called on by a teacher. Yet before his hand even got past his waist, the feeling spiked and Aizawa twisted to look down into the main plaza as well. They both were watching as a tear formed in the air in front of the center fountain. An inky black vortex swirled languidly before getting faster as it grew in size until a hand appeared, pulling on the edge of the ripped space. The hand pushed down hard enough that it near-audibly tore across the air.
13! Get the students out of here. Try contacting the schools and the alarms aren't going off.
Aizawa gripped his gear and pulled his goggles out from where they were nestled in its folds. Izuku watched as a massive black being stepped out of the portal. The class hesitated before they started to back away while 13 urged them towards the entrance. Izuku was glued to the spot. His eyes tracked along after this creature with its brain exposed and the immense radiating pain coming from it. The raw agony that pulsed steadily from it gave Izuku phantom pains as he felt how its body was tearing itself apart piece by piece, in perfect balance with the rapid healing that rebuilt it. It was sad. The entire thing felt unnatural. It made his nerves oddly plateau for a moment in the weird confusion it gave him. He stumbled as Shinso grabbed his arm and jerked him in the direction of the doors, practically dragging him and saying something that Izuku couldn't hear. His brain playing on loop as he broke into incredulous laughter at the absurdity of all of this. It's them. It's the monsters. Of course it is. He hadn't really thought about the dregs of the underground in a while. Of course they would show up to remind him of his godforsaken history and home of the streets. It felt like forever since he had told Yagi about the monsters he had glimpsed in his years. It was almost funny that only after he started finally finding a place in the world that wasn't blurred into the murk of the back streets and questionable choices that they would show up. Monsters that would inevitably be the death of him, just as he always figured. Ones that not only readily but happily killed to raise themselves above the rest. A man covered in hands stood at the front of the incoming small army.
Where is All Might? He was supposed to be here. We went through all of this fuss, and he isn't even where he's supposed to be.
Even from a distance, the rasp in his voice rang clear. A few of the students looked at each other in confusion as they tried to keep a general sense of collection. Shinso was saying his name again, but he kept looking at the stairs, the villains now out of sight due to the height difference.
All right.
The same voice carried over the edge of the stairs.
Say, Eraserhead 13. Would he come if we kill some of the ads?
Neither hero answered as they held to their very hastily thrown together plan, the panic slowly settling over the parts of the class as the reality of the situation was setting in, became near palpable. He pulled his arm out of Shinso's grip when that same rift appeared just before the doors. Everyone pulled up short and fell into various defensive stances as the mist shaped vaguely into the form of a person.
Good afternoon. I apologize for the interruption to usual classes. We are the League of Villains, and while you are not our true target here, we have a mark to make on this world. Regardless of the fact that the goal of bringing about Mr. All Might's end has been pushed back due to complications, I have a role to fill here.
He spoke matter-of-factly. Kirishima and Bakugo both jumped forward at near the same moment, both attempting an attack that the villain dodged smoothly. They bounced back from the mist and looked at him.
Kirishima, this is literally the worst time for you to...
Izuku started to say.
Shut up, you spineless idiot!
Bakugo turned and barked at Izuku.
No, you kids need to move!
13 yelled at them.
13! I can't get any sort of connection to anything outside the building!
Kaminari looked distraught about the fact that Izuku realized that he may actually have a serious trump card with his quirk.
Apologies, but I can't allow that to happen.
The mist surged around them again.
You all will be scattered and then dragged to your own deaths.
Izuku brought his arms up defensively and closed his eyes as the too cold mist pressed into his skin. He reached out with his quirk and gripped every single ache and pain in Yagi's body, even the chronic ones he hadn't touched in months, and pulled on them as hard as he could. He choked on blood welling in his lung, Yagi having irritated it with his exertion through the day. Even as he felt the ground fall out from under him, he kept his grip on the aches that don't go away. Even with panic rising in his mind as the oily black left his vision and he fell quickly towards the water's surface that was now below him, he kept grabbing and pulling and tearing at the pain that had him choking on the blood in his throat and the pain that was compiling in his own body. All in the hopes that Yagi picked up on the fact that something is going really wrong and Izuku needed him now! He stopped pulling momentarily and debated dropping the grip on his form before he hit the water, but decided against it. There were too many people around, heroes, students, and villains that could all possibly target him with a wrong idea, and there was already so much at risk without that in the mix. He gasped in a breath just before impact, which promptly knocked it right back out of him. There's a dazed moment underwater where the muffled feeling of everything was almost calming before he registered the villain with a shark quirk rushing towards him. His heart stuttered as he hurried towards the surface, although before he even hoped to have reached it, something wrapped around his torso and jerked him to a halt.
I got you, Midoriya.
Tsuru's voice sounded surprisingly clear under the water. He twisted around to see her kicking off of the villain, effectively jetting them up toward the surface much faster than how Izuku had been. The moment he broke the surface, he wheezed for air. She dropped him on the deck of the boat, floating along the edge of the flood zone. He didn't even care where he was on the deck as he rolled over and coughed up a splatter of blood from his healing lung. Tsuyu's head appeared over the edge of the ship wall, and he can hear a brief pause in her movements when she saw him and the blood mixing with the water that dripped off of him.
Where were you hurt?
She crouched down next to him and rested a hand on his back, rubbing small circles there as he coughed again, spitting out more blood.
No, I'm fine. It's just my quirk, so don't worry. We need to focus on getting back to the rest of the class.
He wiped his mouth and wondered if the red would be easily washed out of his gloves. Suyu seemed to not be very convinced by his words and watched as he sat back. He could feel Yagi's lung getting aggravated again, which meant he was agitated about something. He yanked on the injury once more and fought down the burning feeling of the blood wanting to bubble up in more coughs. Yet he doesn't feel like he's coming any closer, so he must be getting held up by something. Izuku looked over the edge of the ship to see the small group of villains, all with quirks that likely do best in water, gathered around them. They just needed to get to the plaza.
Tsuyu?
She walked up next to him and glanced over the railings before both crouched out of sight.
Can you get us both over that group if I manage to stun them, even a bit? Like, could you get us close to the edge of the water?
Midoriya, you're coughing up blood. You need to rest a minute, Yaro.
She sounded concerned, even where her face didn't show it. He could only laugh quietly at the comment. It's just funny that in the context of everything going on in the USJ at the moment, a bit of blood was something to stall over. He could feel the aches of sustained quirk use building within the dome.
I've done more with worse, I'm fine.
That's... Yaro. How is that an example of things being better?
Trust me, Tsuyu, please. If these people were as organized as they are trying to look, you wouldn't be with me.
She tilted her head in thought as she tapped a finger against her lip.
You're a frog. If they really did know everything they claim, wouldn't it have been smarter to not send a frog to the flood zone? It isn't exactly efficient in the grand scheme of killing someone.
He waved a hand vaguely.
You do have a point. 13 did mention an area for fire rescue.
She looked at the edge of the railing.
Exactly. There isn't time, though, to sit around up here. We need to go. Can you make the jump?
Izuku grabbed her shoulder as he spoke. They needed to hurry. The longer they sat in one spot, the more vulnerable they would become. She glanced at his hand before she looked him in the eyes. She nodded, and he stood up again, shaking his hands out as if loosening up muscles made breaking bone any more comfortable.
Okay, good. You will need to grab me and drag me along after I jump.
Understood, Yaro.
He took a few steps back on the deck walkway and sucked in a steadying breath.
Let's go, Tsuyu!
Izuku ran as fast as he could in the short distance he had, hopping up last second to use the railing as a last boost to his jump. He aimed down at the water that rose unnaturally next to him, slicing through the boat easily. He looked for the quirk user and adjusted his aim to be closer to the villain. He felt the way one for all swelled under his skin and fired off a shot that concaved the water below, a rip in the calm surface forming from the sudden vacuum of space. Tsuyu's tongue wrapped around his stomach and pulled him through the air. He gritted his teeth as he tucked the hand he used close to his chest. He didn't need to see his finger to know they were likely near black with bruising. The villains shouted and struggled against the powerful current in a futile attempt to get out of its pull. The water ended up surging back upwards and clapping against the surface with the villains thrown around from the force of it. A few of them ended up knocked out from it all. When they land in the water, it's much more graceful than his first time. Izuku getting pulled along by Tsuyu until they were in shallower water gave him a chance to try and sort all the information his quirk was throwing at him. There were injuries all over, and the muffled feeling over a chunk of it all told him that more were unconscious while injured than awake and injured. He looked at the flood zone villains that were beginning to regain their bearings. The ripples of the water settling made them bob on the surface. They needed to get out of the flood zone fast.
Midoriya!
Tsuyu let him go and pointed at the plaza. Izuku could tell what the issue was before he even looked over to where their teacher was fighting. The scalding burn of dry eyes was slowing Aizawa down. He reached out and took away the edge of the burn. He wasn't stupid and knew his limits. He wouldn't be able to reasonably see if he took all of the burning sensation, and it wouldn't change the fact that Aizawa had dry eyes. He was limited to just 2 eyes right now, and he couldn't risk becoming a liability.
What's the next move? We still have villains on all sides, and there's no way to get to the stairs unnoticed with how empty the plaza is, Gero.
She looked around, clearly trying to puzzle it out herself.
Izuku doesn't have an answer.
He watched as Aizawa charged the villain covered in hands, and his mind was blaring sirens that this was going to go wrong somehow. The pulsing pain of the black creature felt almost restless, and it had him on the edge of something he didn't have a name for. Pale hands wrapped around an elbow, and he viscerally felt the way the hero's skin and muscle flaked away. He gasped roughly before ripping it away. There was a choked-off cry of pain as the injury melted off of Aizawa's body. There wasn't really words for how it felt to have his elbow literally turned to dust, where the scar was now spread across Aizawa's. His arm hung limply as he gripped his own bicep, bit his tongue to try and muffle himself, and watched both Aizawa and the villain turn towards him. Blood dripped down his forearm and into the water as his eyes started to burn on their own with tears. The villain's eyes glinted in a way that had Izuku's internal warnings screaming at him. The man barely even started to move in his direction as Izuku braced his feet in the water. With a last-ditch prayer to gods he didn't really believe in anymore, he threw down his grip faster than he had ever remembered doing and screamed, a sound that quickly warped along with his form. And it was wrong. He could tell the moment it started, and it hurt. It hurt more than shifting with injuries ever should. It hurt as he heard Suyu's fearful yelp next to him. It hurt as his scream got louder and sharper, warping further as his bottom jaw cracked down the middle. A crack that became a break that began to tear, and he felt his skin along the bottom of his mouth split. The jagged pull of it felt cold and electric. Blood dripped from its torn edges as his jaw splayed wider with a lack of restriction. He felt taller than he should be and could see spurs down his muzzle that shouldn't be there. The familiar feeling of quills pushing through his skin was now also running along the back of his neck instead of just along his tail. The villain nearly fell backwards as he sucked in another breath, feeling his sides press against something foreign and hard, and screamed again. The skin along his back burned as he felt it peel away from his sides and raise in a sick version of mock fins. It left his sides with an acidic chill where air came into contact with dermal tissue. He stepped forward out of the water, slinging it across the dry tiles as it dripped from his fur. 3 hands splayed flat claws digging through the floor as he sucked in a shaky breath and felt the way his sides pressed and molded vaguely against something jutting through his vents. It was difficult to hold composure or confidence when afraid. Not just of this whole situation, but the fact he had no idea what was happening to him in what should be a normal shift. Izuku could feel eyes on him from all sides, but he didn't let his eyes drift from the villain in front of him. The one who watched him with shock and interest, taking a single step back even as Izuku tucked his injured arm. Aizawa was looking at him with what appeared to be some sort of internal conflict, but he didn't have time to regret anything. He committed to this. He made his choice.
A fucking hidden boss? Really?
The villain's baffled frustration carried across the space between them. Izuku crouched slightly before he surged forward, clearing the gap between them in a single bound. He wrapped around Aizawa, who stiffened immediately when he got grabbed, only to be bodily slung away from the hand villain and his creature filled with pain. Izuku wasn't sure what exactly his plan was now that he was here, but he did accomplish his short-term goal so far. A simple goal of being the closest target to the main issue since he both healed the fastest and moved the fastest. He turned towards the two and planted his hands and feet on the ground firmly, antenna pressed forward to stand tall. His vents vibrated against the things he managed to figure were probably his own ribs in an eerie wheeze as he breathed in, raised his head, and roared at the man. The sound escaping through both his mouth and his vents in such a way that it layered over itself in an unnatural reverberation. At the edges of his vision, he could see his own pedipalps splayed aggressively, giving away how much larger they had become.
You look really cool.
He grinned as he pointed at Izuku.
It's too bad. No!
The black creature, Nomu, apparently practically blinked into Izuku's face. Izuku froze on instinct a second too long. It grabbed his arms and flung him in an arc over its head hard enough that Izuku's body cracked against the ground. The force cracked the tiles around where his body hit. He screeched in pain with how his bones fractured and broke under his skin. The sound echoed off the dome's ceilings, and for half a beat he swore all the fighting paused. He rolled over and felt a shock of pain somewhere, get dropped immediately behind a wall of static. Someone blacked out up the stairs behind him, and he had the worst feeling about it. He pulled his feet under himself, and when he put weight onto his hind leg, it crunched and folded under him, broken. A heavy hand gripped the back of his neck and slammed his head against the ground. His world blurred around him, and he felt one side of his jaw crunch. Blood dripped onto the ground as bone broke through skin. His pedipalps skidded against the ground as he attempted to get up again. He managed to balance oddly on 3 legs instead, head dragging on the ground. The attack doesn't come again, which is confusing. He could feel the cracking pop of his bones slotting and stitching themselves together. The strange pressure of it along his head was distantly alarming, but more so was that he couldn't see properly with how the world spun violently, nauseatingly. He closed his eyes and pressed his antenna further forward, only to register that the Nomu was silently waiting. Izuku did not like that the Nomu was silently waiting. His claws scraped on the tile as he dragged himself with a rumbling growl towards the villain. The shaking of his muscles working to move a half-crumpled form had his quills rattling loudly against each other, all of them on end. Tears started to fall as he tried to figure out what to do. He had never had to fight like this before. His form was unfamiliar all of a sudden at the worst time. His intact hind legs shook from strain, nearly giving out as his growl changed to a weak croak. There's a soft hissing sound he hadn't heard before, and he cracked one of his eyes to see the black mist returning.
Shigaraki.
The mist spoke as it returned to its more humanesque shape. Izuku growled at the man, drawing his attention, and watched as his eyes widened slightly. Shigaraki turned to him, not even sparing a glance in Izuku's direction.
Kurogiri, is 13 dead?
He was bored. The fact that had Izuku growling louder.
Incapacitated, but one of the students got out. He got away when that screech had everyone pulled short. My apologies.
You...
Shigaraki scratched at his neck, grumbling something Izuku couldn't make out. Izuku blinked open a few more of his eyes. The crackling in his head was nearly gone, and the world had stopped spinning. He looked around, trying to figure his next move as his back leg popped unnaturally as it healed. He spotted Aizawa crouched and alarmingly close, moving steadily closer, using Izuku's oddly slumped form as a block to his approach. No, he isn't supposed to be here. He needs to get the other kids out! Izuku cried softly, antenna flicking as if he could convey what he wanted Aizawa to do with that alone. He tries to open his mouth and say something, only to realize his tongue is gone. He doesn't remember if it got taken or if it just didn't carry over in the change. Spit and blood flecked across the ground with a harsh cough.
Stop trying to move,
Aizawa whispered, hidden behind his shoulders. Izuku let out a wheezing cry, blinking away tears that have yet to stop.
Nomu!
Aizawa tensed next to him, and Izuku whined as he looked up at the black figure Shigaraki was addressing.
Finish the mini-boss. Even if we can't find the main boss this time, the EXP will be useful.
Shigaraki waved a hand flippantly. The Nomu refocused its gaze on Izuku again with a wheezing scream that held suppressed pain and distress within it. It reached out to grab his actual head this time, hand large enough to cover the top of his muzzle if it wanted to. Gray cloth wrapped around its forearm, and the Nomu stopped, eyes rolling to focus on Aizawa. Blood was the only thing Izuku registered, so much blood and sickening crunches that happened right next to him. He was useless, as the hero was absolutely battered by the massive strength of the Nomu. He can't even grab at the pain to help heal anything because he still can't even stand on his own. There was a massive explosion near the entrance to the building. Nomu dropped Aizawa as it stood and looked in the direction of the commotion at the call of its name. Izuku warbles in distress as Aizawa was left on the ground. He was alive. He could feel the muffled, shattering pain behind the static wall of unconsciousness. He clawed at the ground and pulled himself forward even more. His back leg was still fixing itself, just short of functional. Pedipalps carefully touched along Aizawa's form, not wanting to do any more damage to him, but feeling the faint pain responses let him know Aizawa still had working nerve roots. He could hear All Might's trademark call, but it brings no relief. He fumbled to usher One for All in his veins and managed to get himself over Aizawa protectively. He closed his eyes with a whine, trying to relax and let his body focus on patching itself at least to the point of having a use. There was a gust of wind as something landed next to him. He flinched involuntarily, even as he felt the strain of All Might.
I'm so sorry, my boy. I should have gotten here faster,
All Might whispered. Izuku just whimpered and angled his body to reveal the absolutely wrecked form of Aizawa. All Might's breath caught for a beat, and then he carefully pulled the hero from under Izuku. He opened an eye to look at his mentor. The distress was subtle but covering every inch of his features. He warbled noisily and pressed his antenna towards the flood zone. He wasn't the priority at the moment, since he had a quirk that very much so benefited him in this moment. His healing flared with the activation of One for All earlier, and he carefully latched onto the quirk. Static sparked from his fur and made it stick out at odd angles as his bones crackled and clicked under his skin.
I will get you when it's safe.
The promise was heartening, but Izuku wasn't putting all that much stock in it. Another burst of wind and All Might was gone. He struggled to not let the creeping exhaustion drag on him. You weren't supposed to sleep after head injuries, and he wasn't entirely sure his head even healed fully yet. He could feel how his jaw still wasn't sitting right, so he was confident his jaw was still broken. That, and there was the way his bone had ground against the tile when he moved earlier. At least he hoped that it was still in progress, and that it hadn't just healed wrong. His awareness of the things going on around him faded in and out as he struggled against the exhaustion tugging on his mind. The information his senses gathered registering not in flashes so much as in ripples of understanding. All Might's quirk boosted speed and the gusts of wind it created. The hiss of another warp forming. A spike in pain. The approach of aching forearms that had his instincts telling him to get it together and run. He gripped his hind claws without much issue, healed but not entirely. The crackling sound of ice forming. Izuku swept away the energy drain of One for All and opened his eyes. All Might was bleeding as he stood just before Bakugo, Kirishima, and Todoroki. They were all in a resting stance, ready to react at a sweat drop, except for Bakugo, who had Kirogiri pinned to the ground. The Nomu sat up, its frozen limbs snapping off, only to grow back rapidly. A familiar urge was bubbling in Izuku as he scrambled to get to his feet. I can help them. I need to help them. Please, gods, let me help them. He got his feet under himself and stood, albeit a little shakily, with his head low but off the ground. He grabbed at All Might's injury and pulls sluggishly at it. The added pain of his side caving in where fingers had broken through All Might's side were just additions to the white noise of pain he could feel. The multiple injuries he had sustained and been slowly healing had pretty much become a flatlining tone in the back of his mind. He was probably in shock. All Might looked down at his side in surprise before looking over at Izuku. Izuku stepped forward and let out a rumbling growl that wheezed out of his vents more than his throat, blood oozing steadily from his side and pooling onto the ground. Tears dripped down his muzzle, and he tried to push away every warning ringing in his brain that he was taking too much, that he needed to stop because he had done enough. The growl ended in him hacking out more blood and spit that ended up sticking to and dripping from his teeth. All eyes were on him again, and he shook his tail around, the quills rattling from the motion. Kirishima and Bakugo both looked at him with the clear notion that he was another enemy. Todoroki had barely visible disgust on his usually blank face. All Might was downright panicked.
So cool.
Shigaraki sounded very excited about Izuku not getting taken down so easily.
You villains. You just drag out every piece of filth with you, from the waste you thrive in.
Todoroki swept an arm in Izuku's direction without a care, ice surging forward in the wake of the motion. The wave of ice reached Izuku before he could fully react. He got frozen half off the ground, front half of his body held suspended from an interrupted bounce back. He whined as the cold rapidly started to feel hot as his nerves misfired from the rapid temperature change. The ice directly touching him started to melt with how hot his body burned. He was stuck again, useless again. All he could do was watch as the Nomu rushed in and veered a punch toward his classmates. His heart clenched in his chest and tried to jerk his way out of the ice with no luck. The dust the blow kicked up settled to show the three teens far out of the way, and All Might in their place black held firm. The conflicting feelings of relief and fear flooded his system because while All Might had succeeded in the mini-rescue, his time limit was a harsh eventuality. He started struggling more violently, but then the ice, the melted surfaces, made his fur slick while his quills and feathers tore at his skin as his body pulled away from them. The broken half of his jaw swung limply as his still damaged bones crackled and likely splintered harshly from how they shifted against themselves. He could fuzzily feel the way the broken bits were patching over the damage he was doing. The Nomu turned its full focus towards All Might. Their initial collision fractured the ground below them blow for blow. They appeared to be an even match. Izuku looked over at the trio who had yet to move. The fact that they were still standing there had him riled. They couldn't be so stupid as to not understand the sheer amount of danger they were in just standing there. In the midst of the battle that raged between the two powerhouses, All Might ducked and missed a punch. At least he missed the Nomu. The gust of pressure hurtled in Izuku's direction, and the ice fractured around him, some of the shards digging into his flesh while others slit along the edges of his form. He dropped to the ground with a hiss of pain. He took a brief pause to center himself. A shout of the school motto was followed by a concussive sound. He looked up to see the roof of the dome shatter and the Nomu's form disappear into the outside world. Izuku immediately zeroed in on All Might with his quirk. The quirk exhaustion was beyond extreme at this point. Even still, All Might squared off against Shigaraki. Steam rose steadily from the hero as he stood in the cloud of dust the brawl had stirred up. Shigaraki's hands twitched with the rage boiling under his skin. Izuku started to walk forward as building static made his fur stand on end. The pulsing thrum of One for All stirring once more rolled through him. His pace quickened as Shigaraki started to run at his mentor. He kicked off the ground as plasma arced off his body, roaring as he lunged for the villain aimed to intercept, jaws wide and claws grasping. He couldn't lose the one good thing he'd found for himself in this god's-forsaken joke he calls a life. He wouldn't make it if he did. 6 sharp cracking sounds rang clear. Shigaraki jerked back, red blooming from each of his limbs in sparse splatters. Pain pierced deep into Izuku's shoulders, the impact of 2 bullets knocking his lunge off course. He cried out as he landed in a tumble, rolling past All Might, who tensed in the self-restraint to keep from moving. Izuku had never felt a gunshot before, not directly. The tumble was absolutely atrocious for the bones that had yet to heal and snapped the ones that were barely fused back together all over again. He doesn't move after the roll stopped. Shigaraki was warped away in a flurry of curses. Izuku looked at All Might, tears streaming down his face, and whined loudly. He couldn't think of anything else to do about the pain he was in. The static dissipated from his fur, along with the energy One for All brought with it. Fear was as clear as day in All Might's expression. It was to him, at least. The blood still dripped from Izuku's side among other injuries and sluggishly pooled under him as he adjusted slowly to a more comfortable position. His antennae swiveled to sit back and his eyes wandered to the excited approach of Kirishima. There was a certain fascination in the eyes of his classmate that he didn't feel comfortable with in the least. A wall burst from the ground just between Kirishima and All Might. The moment it stopped rising, All Might vanished in a cloud and Yagi stumbled before he dropped to his knees next to Izuku.
My boy, what can I do to help? I'm here now. The principal was trying to get me to talk with him, and I should have just...
Yagi looked over his battered body, hands hovering with lost intent. Blind anxieties made the heroic composure vanish, and his distraught nerves took hold. Izuku warbled softly as he followed the motions with his eyes. When his thoughts collected, Yagi's focus settled on the gunshot wounds. Hands pushed fur out of the way. He leaned over his form and felt along the opposite area of the entry points.
They didn't go through. Izuku, we're going to need them removed.
He's gonna be okay. He said we. Izuku whined softly.
All Might, we need to get you out of here untreated without being seen.
Cementos hovered a hand over Yagi's shoulder.
I'm going to be staying right here. You need to get Recovery Girl and bring her to get these bullets out as soon as possible.
He gave Cementos a hard look. There was obvious confusion, and Yagi glanced at Izuku, who just blinked in response. He trusted his mentor.
We need to treat him.
Cementos hesitated as he looked at Izuku's massive form before he nodded and hustled away. Izuku sighed with another whine of pain. The slow loss of adrenaline made his injuries much more evident. He blinked away a few more of the tears that were blurring his vision. Yagi's concerns and worrying made his heart hurt because he knew it was his fault the distress was there at all. He warbled quietly, and his pedipalps reached towards him, patting him gently where they could. He didn't know how exactly to comfort like this. Yagi gave him a small smile and started to tuck the pedipalps under Izuku's neck.
You wouldn't want these to get stepped on if a number of people show up, Izuku.
He let out a huff of air from his vents, which hurt, but the reaction was a bit knee-jerk.
You've already been reckless enough with trying to fight these villains alone with almost no training.
That's rich coming from a one-man army, he warbled back at him in acknowledgement.
But you have shown a beyond exceptional drive to help, to save and protect the people, even in the face of your own fears. I'm proud of that, my boy.
Yagi gently put a hand on his muzzle.
You didn't tell me when you said the bigger you are, you meant that this form could get bigger too. Bigger and spookier looking on top of that.
To be fair, though, Izuku hadn't known. This was a new development. A lot of his life in the past year had been a new development in a long line of changes.
Yo, oh my!
Present Mike's voice came around the wall before he did.
Who's the one who... Ah!
The man pulled up short, bouncing once on a leg with his arms swinging to help stay balanced. Izuku pressed his antenna flat against his neck.
Mike, help me figure out how we are going to move him.
Yagi stood up and stepped gently around Izuku.
He's really hurt.
Well, okay, sure, man, but, He gestured rapidly in no particular sensible way. What is going on here? Izuku looked up at Mike as the hero walked up to his face. He coughed quietly and watched him until they made eye contact. Are you the same? Izuku interrupted him with a low warble. He didn't want to be called a monster to his face. The warble broke into a whine when Yagi's hand ran over the lower end of his back just above his quills. The hand jerked away in apology. Buddy, you sure got yourself into a mess then, being around these guys! Mike scratched next to his nose, apparently completely missing the way Izuku tensed at the offhand comment.
He's not with them. He was trying to protect his classmates.
The harshness of Yagi's correction had Mike looking properly scolded.
I pulled Eraserhead from under him. He really did try.
Exhaustion weighed heavily on Izuku's eyes, and they started to drift close. Hey, kiddo, you can't be doing that! Mike crouched into his line of sight, head tilted with a slight frown to look into his cracked eyes. He croaked softly.
You can't sleep until Recovery Girl clears you for it, my boy.
Yagi sounded apologetic about the fact. He croaked again. They were stuck waiting until she gets there. I'm sure you did great too, big guy. This amount of villains is no joke even for experienced heroes. Mike stood and ummed as he looked over Izuku. The two heroes ended up just talking the whole time, keeping an ear out for Izuku's occasional croaks to show he was still awake. A tense rhythm fell into place as the three stayed behind the wall, interrupted by the harsh coughs that sometimes worked their way out of Izuku. When they started debating how exactly to move him, he zoned them out. The sound of multiple feet had Izuku opening his eyes a bit. He warbled softly, cutting off the conversation Yagi and Mike had been having. Yagi making a stern comment of how he would answer questions later, since it wasn't important at the moment to end the exchange. Izuku probably should have been listening with those last words. Cementos led Recovery Girl, Blood King, and Nezu into view. Nezu clapped his hands together with an excited hum, having perked up immediately as he was set onto the ground.
Oh ho ho! Now this is what I would call a development.
He looked over Izuku with an uncomfortably knowing glint to his eyes.
I take it this is a 20th student to account for, Midoriya Izuku.
Izuku pressed his antenna forward. It would probably be bad to miss any of the discussion that was sure to come from his decision today. Araraka paced in circles, searching around the crowd of her classmates that Ida was making futile attempts to direct. The stress-inducing energy in the class had them all especially buzzed as they talked. There were emergency vehicles all over, many taking away the staggering amount of grunt work villains the self-proclaimed League of Villains brought with them.
I can't find Midoriya, and the cops aren't answering questions about the villains or the inside of the building either. Any luck for you?
So said as he picked his way through the class to her. No, no one else in the class has seen him since that one villain scattered everyone. Suyu isn't talking to anyone at all. I don't understand sign, but Koda just shook his head and Aoyama just said where he ended up is a secret.
Uraraka changed her route of pacing so that she just circled around Shinzo. Mina made a mock shrieking noise before dumping out information about how all the people she saw froze at the sound, allegedly stunned in fear. Jiro added that some of the villains near them actually tripped when it ripped through the dome. The shriek really had been piercing. Although the scariest part was how it had been just moments before 13's quirk was used against them. The sight of their back being eaten away by a black hole right in front of her ingrained into her mind. Kirishima interrupted with how it was probably the giant monster they had ran into in the main plaza. His movements were animated as he explained how he, Bakugo, and Todoroki all had converged at the plaza to find All Might trapped by something one of the villains had called a Nomu. How apparently All Might had already knocked down the other thing beforehand. She noticed Tsuyu watching Kirishima relay his tale, the most intense she had been since they left the doors of USJ. The class was engrossed in the retelling as they listened to the apparent sturdiness of the monster and the intense battle between All Might and the Nomu. The way that the monster allegedly had electricity arcing from its body, adding a whole new level of flair to the picture Kirishima was spinning for them. Two of Ectoplasm's clones exited USJ and approached Tsuyu. They guided her to one of the AMS vehicles, where they grabbed a shock blanket, draped it over her shoulders, and guided her away from the class. They were saying something Uraraka couldn't hear, but Tsuyu replied right away. A few questioned Kirishima more, while the rest of the class devolved into general comments on the battles across the building and debates about the actual competency of the attackers.
Uraraka, are you okay?
Ida looked concerned next to her. She had stopped pacing. I want everyone to be okay, she said as Tsuyu disappeared into the crowd of officials. One of the officers stepped forward, taking off his hat and smiling brightly.
All right, aside from the two under medical care, the class is all here.
He addressed them all, getting everyone's attention at the first word.
For now, you all will need to return to your classroom and wait for further instructions.
What about Aizawa-sensei? Yaomomo asked, hand raised patiently. The detective pulled out his phone and dialed the number. The class waited quietly as it rang, and the detective relayed the question.
Eraserhead is in critical condition. He has multiple comminuted fractures in his arms and loss of some tendon density in one of his elbows. The doctors aren't sure how to explain some of the scar tissue built up over recent injuries. They're still running scans on how severe the damage to his orbital floor is, but they have concerns about its possible effects on his vision in the future.
The detective stated the information clinically.
And 13? Uraraka asked nervously. Stable, along with All Might. They have minor lacerations to the back of their neck and much more severe ones to their back. Their suit actually took the brunt of the initial damage and probably played a part in their survival. All Might is just getting a basic check over to ensure that there wasn't anything subtle the villains could have pulled. We don't know all the quirks present, and their reported target was All Might. He hung up the phone. As I've been told, at least.
What about Tsuyu? She got taken away by ectoplasm earlier.
Hagakure's gloved hand flagged down the attention of the surrounding students. She was at the plaza longer than the rest of you all and is being monitored by Recovery Girl for shock recovery.
Then what about Deku? Uraraka interrupted Ida's near-identical question. No one has seen him since we all got separated.
All students are under the care they need, I promise. Don't worry. The detective put his hat back on. I have business to attend to in the infirmary, so I must be going. Sansa, you're the head of the field now.
An officer with a cat head saluted as the detective hurried past vehicles and out of sight. They were all guided onto the bus they had arrived on. Their ride back was much quieter than their ride there. Everyone was staring out windows or at hands or feet as the weight of the villain attack on UA sank in. Sitting in the classroom after they had changed back into their uniforms wasn't much better. One by one they were taken out for a statement before getting released to their families or to head home. When she left the room, she gave her statement and she walked towards and waited near the entrance. Kirishima stopped next to her a while later and they waited in a companionable, if tense, silence. The events of the day had everyone in thought. Shinso was the next to join them, and when Ida finally got there, no one really had words all of a sudden.
So they want us to withhold information from any probable leak to the media.
Shinso broke the silence.
That and school is on break until further notice.
Ida nodded.
They said Midoriya is in medical care, right? We could probably find him in the medical wing then. Recovery Girl is probably fixing him up right now.
Kirishima tried to sound confident despite the nerves everyone had about the dodgy air the officers held with the questions related to any of their classmates.
Let's go! I'm worried about him.
Uraraka started walking towards Recovery Girl's office. The other three followed close behind. The empty halls felt wrong, even if they were to be expected after school hours. They turned the corner to see two of Ectoplasm's clones waiting at the start of the medical wing. She looked back and shared a confused look with the rest of them before continuing forward. One of the clones held out a hand to stop them.
The medical wing is off limits until further notice,
he said calmly.
Recovery Girl has a temporary office next to the teacher's lounge if you need to see her.
We wanted to come check on Midoriya. The officers said he was in medical care.
Kirishima insisted.
The injured need to rest and aren't allowed visitors. Recovery Girl's orders.
The other clone informed them. The group let out a collective, dejected sigh. There was a moment where Uraraka debated pushing the topic further. It was only when Ida took the lead on the return trip to the entrance that she let it drop. She wasn't happy about letting it drop, but trying to force their way past Ectoplasm's clones after a villain attack was probably not the smartest idea.
Ectoplasm said injured.
Shinso broke the quiet of the walk back.
It did nothing in the way of comforting me that they won't let us see him, especially when injured.
Uraraka picked a hair off her uniform. She wanted something to do with her hands.
You think it's that bad? Maybe he just needs to sleep?
Kirishima offered.
Debating it isn't going to do anything but stress us out more, so I say just leave it for now.
Shinso's shoulders were hunched as he strode a bit ahead of the group. She frowned at the way Shinso was closing himself off. They needed to be there for each other at this point, not pulling away. Outside the main gates, two different women were waiting, talking quietly. Once one spotted them, the other was quick to turn around.
Ajiro! Hitoshi, thank goodness!
They both ran up to their respective child. There was a general clamor over concerns for the well-being of them all, parental worries overflowing to all teens present. Uraraka laughed when Shinso finally pushed his mother away, face turning pink in embarrassment. It took a bit for her and Ida to reassure the rest of them they were fine going home like usual.
Want me to walk you home, Uraraka?
Ida asked while they waited in the train station for the next arrival. She thought about her small rental apartment her parents got for her to attend UA and the setting sun outside the station.
You know what, Ida?
She looked at him with a small smile.
I'd appreciate that.
Then lead the way.
He smiled at her and they boarded their train. Yagi sat on a stool near the window of the hours ago modified medical office. One of the walls had been taken down by Cementos so as to lay out Izuku's massive form. 3 rooms became one long room. There were multiple machines and devices hooked onto him and bandages wrapped carefully around limbs and other wounds. Some of his injuries actually had to get stitches before bandaged. A tall stand was holding the bag for fluids and a blood transfusion near the boy's shoulders. They had to do a test initially since there were no real medical records directly on file aside from vaccinations. The steady rise and fall of his massive side, held within the bones jutting out of the vents on his side, was a comfort. It was small, but enough to help him dispel the internal paranoid whispers that he almost hadn't made it. The beeping of the monitors remained stable. Recovery Girl had cleared Izuku for sleep after extensive checks of his head. Aside from his jaw, which was bandaged into place now, the skull had minimal to no damage, and every reactionary test was passed. She had left to check on the other students after explaining she couldn't do anything with her quirk since he was already facing quirk exhaustion on his own. Izuku would need to both recover stamina and have a break from his extensive quirk usage before she tried to use hers on him. They had to wait.
Oh, my boy. I'm so very sorry I let this happen to you,
he whispered to the otherwise empty room. The sun had set by now. Ectoplasm walked into the room.
The detective and principal are waiting for you in the meeting room,
He said softly, respectful of the situation, even without knowing the full extent of it. Yagi closed his eyes and sighed, trying to relax even a little before getting up.
Let me know if he wakes up while I'm gone.
Of course, All Might. He stepped out of the doorway to let him pass. Yagi didn't think he would be getting any rest tonight.